Okay, yes, thank you, Lily, and we're really delighted to welcome Matt Dryhurst and Holly Herndon here this evening. Uh, I was delighted to have the unforgettable experience of seeing Holly in concert with Matt at the Barbican in 2019, and I've just discovered that we will be seeing a short clip of that concert. I'm also regularly listening to their Interdependence podcast, which I would also recommend to everyone. I hope to subscribe if you don't already, but you will encounter their kind of theorists and historians and makers in all forms of kind of creativity, and the conversation ranges from Hildegard of Bingen to John Cage and AI, the politics of AI to the politics of Spotify. Matt Dryhurst releases music, research and artwork solo and in conjunction with creative partner Holly Herndon, teaches at NYU's Clive Davis Institute of Music and hosts discussions with figures shaping 21st century culture on the Interdependence podcast. He is also an alumnus of the Media Arts Department here at Royal Holloway. Holly Herndon operates at the edge of electronic and avant-garde pop music and emerges with a dynamic and disruptive canon of her own. On her most recent full-length album, Proto, Herndon fronts and conducts an electronic pop choir comprised of both human and AI voices over a musical palette that encompasses everything from synths to Sacred Heart stylings. CNN noted that Herndon is, quotes, shaping the future of AI, and she's demonstrated this nexus of technological evolution and musical catharsis with elevated performances at the Barbican London, the Volksbühne Berlin, Sonar Barcelona, Unsound Krakow, and Club to Club Milan. The sounds synthesized on Proto by Herndon, her AI quotes baby Spawn, and the vocal ensemble combine elements from Herndon's dynamic and idiosyncratic personal journey, timeless folk traditions of her child experiences in church-going East Tennessee, particularly the prismatic layered practice of Sacred Heart singing, the avant-garde music she explored while at Mills College, and the radical club culture of Berlin, all enhanced by her recent completion of a doctorate at Stanford University's CCRMA, researching music learning and music. Matt and Holly are now going to kind of play something for a few minutes, and then we'll Lily and I will ask a few questions and then we'll open it to the floor because I'm sure there are lots of people with more questions of their own.
Thank you, Adam. And apologies to you and everyone for sharing the really long Holly bio. It's like, I think I actually haven't heard that before. It's very thorough.
So Matt's going to do us a solid and he's going to kind of introduce our work a little bit, and I'm going to,
yeah, exactly. So for those, we're going to share a screen. This is actually a presentation. So quite often we have like 3 or 4 presentations for very specific contexts and like not very many for a more general context. So I'm going to end up filling in some of the information, I'm guessing.
And trying to be brief because these presentations sometimes go on for hours. So
yeah, it could be wild. I do actually want to play the Super Mario thing though, because I think that would be really fun. Okay, so. All right, can you all see that? Yes.
You need to press play.
Yes. Yes. All right, okay. Yeah, so as oh, excuse me. So as described, thank you for the generous introduction. Yeah, so Holly and I mean, I guess what's most important is, and I'm guessing a lot of the questions are going to be quite practical in mindset, which is really useful. Like we make a living in usually from making albums and touring them. Sadly, we haven't been able to do that for the last year for obvious reasons. But the basic idea of the practice, which we'll probably get into a little bit more, is, we end up working on research projects or like fun exercises and things we're curious about. And then invariably all of those kind of funnel into music. And so the albums, this is the cover of the last record, Proto. It came out on 4AD, I think, in 2019, I guess, or 2018. Everything feels like it was a million years ago now. But yeah, so Proto came about basically as a result of years of kind of experimentation and research specifically in the realm of machine learning or artificial intelligence. And yeah, so most of the songs that you'll see on there, I don't know if this separates. I mean, maybe other people do this, but like when I see all the songs on there, I can think of like very discrete, specific experiments that we did that ended up with Birth, and that ended up with the technique that was used on Crawler, and that ended up with Godmother, etc. And so maybe that's something that's kind of distinct to the way we do things. Yeah, so this is Spawn. Adam kind of referred to Spawn a little bit. Spawn is our AI baby. We'll get into that a little bit, but the basic idea for a lot of Proto was, you know, we're a couple. AI babies are cheaper than real babies, which is helpful. And yeah, we basically put together it's kind of like a stack or like a basket of different neural networks to attempt to get them to sing. And the whole idea was, as was kind of alluded to in the biography, that we wanted to put together a vocal ensemble to perform these works and to create the works, and thought it would be kind of a cool idea for at least one of those members of the ensemble to be an inhuman intelligence. We'll get into this a bit later, I'm sure, but there's a great opportunity in not only singing neural networks, but in thinking about performative AI in collaboration with humans, as opposed to the standard kind of kitsch narrative that we've inherited, that, you know, AIs are just going to write everything for us or whatever. That to us was always quite boring. So here's an example of like the earliest experiment with this, and it'll be fun because I'll drag in a file of something that we were doing recently to see how far it's come. But this is so that was the first attempt we had of getting Spawn to recognize Holly's voice. And then what you're hearing there is, it's too much to get into exactly what you're hearing, but what you're hearing there is Spawn attempting to talk or babble, kind of like Holly. Oh yeah, I'll move on. But the first thing that we released on this was this track called Godmother, which was kind of an advancement of that same technique, where we collaborated with a close friend of ours, Jay Lin, who's a really incredible producer from the States. And we asked for Spawn to listen to Jay Lin and then re-perform Jay Lin's music in Holly's voice. And it ends up sounding like this. I won't subject you to too much of it, but it's pretty wild. Yeah, I'm going to keep moving on. Yeah, I'll move on. And so one of our frustrations with this kind of process was that given the processing kind of intensiveness of experimenting with machine learning for that period of time, from like 2016 up until the past year or so, is that we couldn't really take that stuff live. And so part of the idea of the ensemble was that, one, we kind of counter the traditional narrative of AIs displacing humans by making economically like unrealistic decisions to put as many humans as possible on stage, which is like a very costly, cost intensive thing to do. But we also took the opportunity to involve people in the process by basically saying, you know, can we train our neural network with the voices of the people who attend the concerts? And so this is actually from the performance that Adam alluded to earlier at the Barbican, which is the first time I've seen Adam in a really long time. It was very nice to meet up with you. Yeah, of us leading a call and response chant in order to train Spawn. And this gets more interesting when you hear what we're going to play after it. Keep us safe. Keep us safe. Safe in life. Safe in life. Secure from all. Secure from all. Yeah, but what's wild about that is we now have, I think, we have kind of a database of like easily over 100,000. I can't put like a strict number of people who all contributed to the same training set. And so technically now we're able to create an instrument using all of those people's voices, which feels quite beautiful. What I'm going to do just to cut this off, because this presentation can go forever, is I'm actually going to drag something in here from that we're working on at the moment, which I think is really rad.
Do you want to play the Maria thing?
Oh yes,
that's in there.
That's in there. Yes. Okay. So yeah. So more recently, what the stuff we've been working on is thinking about tools for real-time performance, because that was always the original intention. And so Holly actually produced a track recently for a wonderful Catalan singer called Maria Arnal. And yeah, you can hear where that's at, which is pretty good. Wait, so this is an example of Maria's voice, and Catalonian singing is really great for this because there's a lot of ornaments. There's a lot of like moving around. So I'll play Maria's voice. Yeah, so what if Maria was a flute? What's really nice about that one is that unlike a lot of the stuff we've done in this realm is you don't have to explain it. You're just like, what if Maria was a flute? And it just kind of makes sense. But that's kind of an allusion to some of the stuff we've been working on. Like we're actually working on that project specifically with the people at Google Magenta, who are absolutely brilliant. And then I'm going to drag into this file just quickly the latest thing we're doing, which is kind of fun. Wait, where is it? Oh, God.
Just search Mario.
Oh yeah, wait. Oh no, my desktop. Here we go. Yes. Da-da-da. Here we go. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
You have to press play.
So if you're familiar with the Super Mario theme, what we're working on at the moment is a real-time polyphonic system for anyone to be able to perform in Holly's voice. And so this is an example of us feeding the Super Mario theme to the system. This is after 2 days of training. We're actually currently in the process of training it for months. So it's going to get really good. But this is the latest in that. Anyway, yeah, so that's kind of where we're at the moment is, and maybe that's kind of illustrative of what we end up doing, right? Is like ultimately now we're developing that tool. To be honest, a polyphonic style transfer tool, like I just explained, that doesn't really exist before we just did it. And then
so we get really excited about things that sound like that in the studio. Yeah. People are like, why are you so excited?
Exactly. But invariably, no doubt there'll be a record in a year or two's time that are using some of the stuff that we've been doing. So hopefully through like showing this, we could present for a couple of hours on other stuff that we worked on, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavor of like what we do, and how ultimately everything is kind of funneled toward like a live show, but it starts with very small breakthroughs like that.
we back? Yes.
Yeah, we're back. Sorry.
Oh, cool.
I hope that was helpful. Sorry, I was trying to like reduce it down to something manageable.
Oh, great. I think so. Adam and I have prepared a few questions, and it's kind of like counterintuitive after having watched this to just like jump into the
no, it's good.
the questions. But I guess we'll go back to all of what we've just seen and heard actually, which was great. So I guess one of my own first questions was, of course you are where you are right now, but could you tell us a little bit about how you got here? And I guess it's like a very long story for both of you, but are there any moments where you were kind of like, that you feel were decisive?
Oh gosh, there were so many. I think one really important thing that Matt and I both have in common and that kind of brought us together is we were kind of deep scene people. So we were really heavily involved in our local scenes and also kind of communicating, internationally with different scenes and trying to find like new records and that kind of stuff. And so that part really, I think the kind of academic side without that kind of like deep local investment wouldn't have been we wouldn't have found each other, but it also, I think, made our academic studies richer.
Yeah.
And then a couple other kind of pivot points for me. One was going to Mills College, which sadly, RIP, they just closed.
Yeah.
So my alma mater is, but that was a pretty incredible, special place in Oakland, California that specialized in experimental electronic music. There aren't very many places that were quite like that. So that was where I started. That's where I learned how to program and things that really weren't approachable to me before going to that environment became approachable all of a sudden. And so that was kind of like an aha moment for me. And then I would say another moment would be going to Karma at Stanford, all for different reasons. And we can get into some of that stuff later.
Yeah, I would say like to echo that, I mean, Holly and I met through very obscure noise music when there was no, I mean, there's barely an economy for what we do now, but there was no economy for what we do then. And I think that, the big takeaway for me in a sense is like pretty much everything. Like, I do think that it's really important to have institutions, academic or, public institutions to help you to kind of formalize what you do. But I don't think there's nothing that can adequately compensate for just participating in things, which sounds kind of easy to say, but honestly, that is the Midas factor. Like, we've been in and around, I mean, actually not me. My only real academic entanglement was actually going to Royal Holloway.
That's not true. You went to UCLA.
Well, I dropped out after a year. But anyway, but that's I only have an undergraduate degree, right? But obviously being married to Holly, I've been in and out of academic institutions for a very long time. And that's really the takeaway for me is like, unless of course, and it's very legitimate to want to go into a research position. But generally speaking, the kind of the common denominator between everyone I've seen is participation, and academics can really help with that. But without that participation, like going out and just trying stuff out in the real world, for so to speak, that's the common denominator of people who seem to be doing it after,
well, and
decades.
Maybe that leads on to another question. Given that you studied in the media arts department, and we didn't like have any music then, and I think we do now teach some coding, but we certainly didn't do that. Was any of it any use? And in which case, what was the stuff that was productive or helpful about what you're doing now?
Yeah, it was wild. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I mean, I think I joined the program when I was like 17. I was young. And at the time I grew up in Kuwait, and I actually desperately wanted to live in London. And so I was at Royal Holloway and I was going out, speaking of participation, I was going out like every night by myself, pre-iPhone, of course, like pre-GPS. So just getting lost in Dalston or whatever, because I was just thirsty for music, and I'd actually grown up in the desert. So all this stuff was like so novel to me. Like I'd never been to a show before, and so the program was actually very helpful for me for a few reasons. I mean, I very much remember like learning a great deal about cinema, which was something that, to be honest, like it's kind of an unresolved thread for me, but it's something that like I still have like an intense interest in as a result of that experience.
And this has also definitely filtered into our practice. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
Matt has like art directed and shot and done
Yeah.
like, you know, made almost all of our videos. And without his kind of like eye for cinema, a lot of our projects would have suffered.
Well, and also for context, I mean, again, it's a different world now, right? Because like I believe I started at Arhol at it was like 2000. It's very much a different world. Like I remember the first week we were shooting with VHS on things that cost like were heavy, that were like very heavy, you know. I mean, like, which is mad to think. I mean, it's mad to think how much things have changed. And I'm not even that old. I'm like 35. You know, it's not but for me, I mean, it was also an intense experience also to just be around people who had such like honed down interests. That was mind blowing to me. And I don't think I was in the place at the time, if I'm absolutely honest, to fully appreciate that. Because I was a kid and I hadn't got my head around it, but it was very instructive to see. I'm forgetting the professor's name, but there's a professor who'd studied in Krakow at the film school. And he used to have like 3 screens. You probably remember. but for me, like encountering people who were like so deep into what they were doing. I also fondly remember Jacob Lee. I don't know if he's still there, but
You're still there, yeah.
But just encountering people who were so intensely into what they did was actually very, very instructive to me, because I was not coming from that context whatsoever. Like I don't come from like an arty background, or you know, this was not yeah. So I mean that for me was maybe the biggest thing. But most of like my like refining stuff that I'm doing now kind of ended up kind of happening just like gathering moss in the world in that intervening 15 years, you know. Like I'm not like a trained musician, I'm not a trained developer, but yeah, everything was kind of pragmatically or practically kind of thrown together because I wanted to accomplish something. And then oftentimes it's way cheaper and easier to do it yourself than, you know.
We often call Matt the Swiss Army knife.
Yeah. The term for me is fix it nerd. If there's any problem in the world, I'm definitely the I'm cheap. I'm a cheap option.
So
okay, maybe, yeah. So our next question is actually sort of related to what you've just said about the importance of other people and kind of like, yeah, absorbing what people do around you. But I mean, it sounds a little bit cliche maybe to ask, but it is a genuine question. What does collaboration mean to you? And how do you sustain a healthy collaborative relationship?
Well, this took a while, actually, you know, to figure out, to learn how to be a couple and to collaborate. I mean, it's not like it happened overnight. It took like tears and fights and all that good stuff. But I think ultimately what the takeaway, the learning point is that the work has to be the most important. You have to remove your ego from it, and it doesn't matter who came up with the idea. It's if the work is better for a contribution from elsewhere, whether that be Matt or myself or someone else, then that is the most important thing. And that's really hard to learn when you're first starting out, because when you're creating artwork, it's so personal. It feels like this personal expression, but it has to be more important than your own ego. And that also sounds kind of cliche, but it's ultimately true.
No, it is true. And I think that's also what, like, thinking chronologically about it, there was also a period of time when we were first working together where we were both figuring out what we were. And that was the most tense time, because then you're like, no, I want it to be like the, you know, and at the time, I mean, your first record, we weren't collaborating.
Right.
Like we had bands together, and then Holly just went and made a solo record, and that was the one that got big, typically. But I think that there's those clashy moments where you're trying to figure out like what you want to do. But then once you figure out what you are, then that kind of ego death kind of needs to happen. Because there is some truth to that, right? Like we're over a decade deep into like, not necessarily being full-time professional artists, but like being on the circuit. And over time, generally speaking, like it's not the most, how would you say, like pure project that ends up going the furthest, because everything is a marathon. And actually figuring out how to make things work, particularly now, right? Like particularly when label infrastructure and support infrastructure is about as barren as it has ever been. like figuring out how to do something pretty good that you're really happy with, but you actually get it done, versus having the perfect idea. And trust me, I mean, we are definitely those people. Like, I could sit on something for 10 years and want to tinker away at it because it's just it's my proclivity or whatever. But like figuring out a way to do that, collaboration is also really helpful, right? Because if you're kind of,
If you're stuck on something, someone else can pick it up.
yeah, if you're in circumstances with a group of people and they're kind of waiting on you, then it puts a bit of a deadline on those things. And that's, I mean, just to speak to that point, like that was always kind of, whenever we've dealt with friends like that, who are dealing with that, the biggest pressure point for us was like, or that I would recommend, is just like book a show. You know, like you've got this perfect album in your head, okay, book a show. And like it might suck, but you're going to be so much closer to realizing the big perfect album once you've tested it out and you've done it, and it isn't just this kind of perfect painting in your head that might only exist in your head, you know. And so collaboration, I think, really pulls that necessity out in people. Sorry,
Thanks
I didn't
so
mean to
much.
interrupt.
I just say people have started to put some questions in the chat. Do keep them coming, and we'll also kind of edit them or bring them together. But there's already stuff about. Anyway, you have an AI child. Do you describe it together called Spawn? Do you want to talk a little bit about it? And also, you've called her. Is there a reason? You know, is all AI gendered, and should it all be?
Ooh, okay, a lot to unpack there. So Spawn is our AI baby, inhuman baby, not a human baby. We realize that it's a complicated metaphor. The reason why we chose the metaphor of a kind of like young life is because we saw this as something that was really nascent and needed kind of community care and, you know, raising with a kind of a community in mind. Also thinking about how, you know, machine learning tools only really know what kind of information they've been given. They can't really go outside of that. So really being able to control a kind of healthy diet of information for our AI baby was I think a kind of way to speak to that, to maybe like a broader audience. You know, a lot of the work that we do speaks to it's almost like an onion. Like there's all these different layers of kind of information that you can kind of peel back. And so we're speaking to like a really broad music audience, but we're also sometimes speaking to a more academic audience, or, you know, there's many layers. And so we try to find ways, kind of bridges, where people can quickly understand something that might be a more complicated idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the I'll let you address the gender point, but yeah, exactly. It's like a lot of the challenge, which is maybe I mean, how to put it? It's kind of like an underrepresented challenge, is exactly what Holly said. It's like in any one conversation, like you take a Twitter account, it's like we have like people in intense research communities, like people in intense academic communities, and like 16-year-olds who just like electronic music. And the balance and the dance that you're inevitably always going to stumble a little bit doing is like trying to find some kind of a device to be able to cover that accurately, and so you can stand behind it. And so Spawn and the baby narrative was like an attempt to do that, because it kind of covered all of the interests that we had. Spawn has actually recently turned into a verb, which is maybe a bit abstract, but like the whole idea being that you know, it's one thing to critique and it's another thing to propose things. And so one of the proposals that we made, we didn't have time to really show it, but we made, for example, a spawner as opposed to a sampler. And so the basic idea there is whereas sampling was like a one-to-one reproduction of something, right? Like you don't want to call it a dumb reproduction because that has connotations, but it's not like a very smart reproduction of things. You can pitch it up and you can pitch it down. And generally it doesn't have any connection. There's no like attribution mechanism with sampling, right? Like, which has like a crazy history. It just tends to be a recording of things that is removed from its context. Our proposal would be to Spawn is to say, number one, when you're working with machine learning now, the big opportunity and what's actually going to change the way most people make music as opposed to sampling is that you'll be able to create and generate new audio based on a source idea, right? So that's very different to a sample. Like you can't like just make a new sample that is like the child of an old sample. That doesn't really exist. You can do it a little bit with synthesis if you want to get particular about it, but it doesn't really exist. Whereas with machine learning and a lot of this audio generation stuff we've been working with, that's very much a potential. So Spawn is now turned into a technique. But again, it kind of serves a purpose, you know, because when we're talking to people, at least in research communities or like who are maybe more nerdy about music stuff, that also makes sense, right? Like spawning audio from a training corpus or like a training set, like just kind of makes sense. It's like, okay, yeah, it's not sampling, it's spawning, right? Yeah.
And the reason why Spawn is a she is because I trained Spawn initially on my own voice, and I identify as she. So I heard myself when I heard her initially speak. So that she just immediately was a she in my mind. And this became actually kind of a controversial point for some people, because there is this issue with female digital assistants who, you know, research shows that people mistreat their digital assistant, and then that translates into the real world. And it is actually a political issue. But for me, this was a very personal relationship I was having with this machine learning tool that I was making. And so that was just a choice that I made.
Thank you. That's a very beautiful metaphor. I was also like, in dialect, certainly spawny means lucky.
Mm-hmm.
So
oh, wow. Yeah, cool.
Spawny git is somebody who's lucky. So maybe there's another way that spawning works. Lily.
Yeah. So the next question that we have is actually for Holly, and it's something that I wanted to ask, because I still remember when Home came out, and my friends and I were all sort of sharing links to it, and we're just sort of like thinking, you know, how amazing it is. But where is Home, you know, today? Because it's been almost a little bit over maybe 6 years now, right?
That's wild.
Yeah. So what does Home mean to you today? And yeah, do you still have the same relationship with your computer?
I think Home was a really important kind of turning point in that, you know, I moved to California and I was working with all these new digital tools, and I was so wide-eyed and excited to have this computer, and felt like it was really like liberating me from my physical body, and was really having that like California moment. And Home was me kind of like coming back to earth and understanding the kind of implications of having such a digital life. And so I think that still is present in the work that we're doing today. It's just kind of this balance between a genuine kind of curiosity and experimentation with technology, but always trying to have a critical lens and understanding, you know, what are some of the kind of dark sides of something, but also not trying to focus too much on that, you know. So for me, it's really kind of always trying to find that balance. And
I guess Home also means being stuck in this apartment for the for the past year. It's definitely yeah, kind of definitely stressed our relationship with Home. It's
interesting. We actually haven't mentioned not really lockdown yet, but I feel like we've all accepted that it was happening, so nobody really wants to talk about it anymore.
Maybe it's better. Yeah.
Matt, you've also been politically talking a lot about kind of streaming and Spotify and your interventions. Can you tell us a little bit about Saga and what you're doing there and where you see that as leading?
Yeah, of course. Like, yeah, I mean, basically, again, like in about 2012, 2013, I started doing like strange performances. And at the time I kind of like, I wanted to develop a tool basically that, how to put it? So I started doing these odd performances where I would like sample the room, because at the time there were all these like Facebook events that was kind of like a new thing. And so you'd be able to play a show, and then people would go to the show and you'd be able to see who was coming in advance, right? And all their information would be available on Facebook. So I was like, okay, I'm going to use this information as part of the performance, because this is kind of new. You don't usually get given information about someone's sister, when a show happens, right? And so part of the idea with that was that like every show would be somewhat different, and would speak specifically to the room that was in there, right? And then from that, I was like, okay, well, it's kind of weird that we don't have tools that do that online, right? So like, actually, it's weird that, you know, you upload a track to SoundCloud, or you upload a song to YouTube, and then it's kind of the same for everybody. It doesn't, like, the context in which it's appreciated doesn't really change the artwork in any way. And in fact, that wasn't strictly true, because the one area where that did actually happen is with advertising, right? So you're all, I mean, you're probably not in the greater London area at this point in time, but like wherever you are, actually you get served different content. That was kind of like a device that YouTube and other the kind of data collection services that use to appeal to you, right? And so I was like, well, what would it mean to like put those tools in the hands of artists, right? Because it's kind of a bit unfair that YouTube and like, you know, Colgate or whatever gets this information to speak to people directly, and artists still have to operate in these kind of broad strokes, these general terms, kind of like the, you know, releasing a record in the 1970s. Like it hasn't changed that much. So I made Saga. Which is basically it's a lot to talk about. It's like a decentralized publishing framework. So the idea is you'd host whatever media you wanted to put out there, and then you'd spread the media out, and then you get information about everywhere where it lived, and then you could change different pieces of media based upon the context that they were online. And so the term I was using at the time was website specific media, right? Website specific performance, kind of like site specific performance, if people are familiar with that term. And anyway, from there, long story short, like the project kind of existed as a weird art thing for a while. I couldn't actually get any funding to develop it, which is annoying because lo and behold, 6 years later, we now, I'm sure some of you have heard all about NFTs, and that infrastructure. So fortunately through Saga, I got involved in the Ethereum community actually quite early with some of these ideas, because the only other people at the time who were working on this idea of like non-fungible moments, or, you know, media that artists control and go back to a particular source. The only people thinking about that, ideas like smart contracts, which I was working on smart contract stuff, but I didn't know it was called a smart contract at the time, were people in Ethereum. And so, yeah, in that period of time, obviously that space has become more prevalent, and I've worked a lot in that space on various projects. To speak to the Spotify thing, you know, our basic term on this, and we go a lot into this on the podcast, and kind of like I've been ranting about this for the best part of a decade, is that, you know, there's kind of a core absurdity to this idea that one central actor or one central kind of company or organization, particularly a very opaque one like Spotify, have so much power over people's lives and careers, right? Like have so much power over your social life. And so if there's kind of some kind of an easy segue to explain like why Saga exists and why I've been very interested in the decentralized web space, it's exactly that point, is that one size fits all is a really absurd proposition and an absurd imposition on culture, actually. And quite the opposite to what I kind of admire about culture, which is the idea that you get these odd pockets, you get these odd idiosyncratic areas that do things differently, right? But and one of my frustrations with Spotify, for example, is that coming up and like listening to like hardcore music and like weird tape labels that, you know, were so basic and so elemental, and you basically just had like a little bit of artwork and then some folklore around your band or whatever. Like, how did artists manage to use that medium to be more distinguished in what they were doing than you can do on Spotify? Like you can do in, you know, allegedly the state of the art kind of media environment that we participate in. So yes, there's a lot to, again, we could talk about that for a long time, but that's kind of the genesis of Saga, how I got interested in these ideas. And then, yeah. And I'm still, you know, I'm still working on some of that stuff now.
Thank you. I won't ask about NFTs right now, but I think everyone who's here in the audience wants to talk about it more. Maybe I've been advised not to do it, so for now. But you both talk about sort of the uses and abuses of AI in musical composition, in terms of kind of like, you know, deep fake music. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and where your own work intervenes within that kind of landscape.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when we started working with machine learning, it became really clear that there were many actors who were interested in kind of this replacement narrative. So being able to create an automated composition machine so that the composer no longer needed to exist. And I thought that was a really kind of impoverished view of how culture comes about. If a machine is trained on a past canon of work, it will reproduce that past canon, something similar to that. And actually, composition is a living, breathing art form that needs to be constantly updating and responding to the world around it. So that was a really big problem that we saw in the field. So we made several decisions to kind of intervene with that. We didn't use MIDI scores. So a lot of kind of like technical details in how we address that. But ultimately, we came to the conclusion that we have, as humanity, we have kind of like a shared human media archive, and we have to figure out a better way to deal with it than we have in the past with technology such as sampling. There are a lot of kind of parallels between spawning and sampling. And there are just so many egregious issues with the way that sampling was handled in the past. And so we hope that we can intervene a little bit with policy to try to find a better, more equitable way to spawn in the future. Because when you have kind of a musical style or a vocal affect, when that kind of inspires another human, they're kind of operating in this gray area between like appropriation, inspiration. There's this kind of gray area of creation. But when that's done by a machine and automated, that dynamic changes. And so we kind of need to answer some of those questions now because it's happening.
Yeah, it's funny. Like when we try on the podcast, one of the efforts we've been trying to do is like basically have conversations with decision makers who are working on this stuff, at Google or at Spotify or whatever. They're working on, implementing these machine learning techniques. And that was one of the takeaways is like, there's some danger in a sense, like if you read like media arts books from the 90s talking about, for example, like freedom of information, these great utopian techno ideas from the 90s, and you start applying that to this kind of state of the art with these very centralized organizations, you don't want those two things mixing, right? Because we've had, for example, like conversations with OpenAI with really smart and really wonderful people there who didn't see any issue in, generating songs in the style of a living person and not asking them, let alone compensating them. This is a very moneyed organization, but not even asking their permission. And they're like, oh yeah, it's like sampling, right? It's like rave music. And we're like, no, you're one of the most powerful companies in the world. It's not like rave music.
It's an ethics organization.
It is an ethics organization. Yeah. But simple things like this, and these are wonderful, well-meaning people, but you get this kind of historical lag of like ideas that were utopian and really cool 20, 30 years ago that still have merit, don't get me wrong. But when they're kind of applied to people who think they're the punks, but are actually in power, you're kind of like, no, that's terrifying. We can't have it be that Google can, let's be real. Google did sample everything and not have to pay for it. That's how Google exists, right? But we can't have it be that Google can sample all existing music and then allow anybody on the consumer side to generate a Holly-like song without figuring out some kind of compensation for that, right? Like that. And if we inherit these kind of romantic ideals from the 90s, as much as some of them are still nice, it's not always necessarily like the progressive thing. Things change, like tech changes. Anyway, yeah. So there's a lot on that issue, but again, maybe the best approach, or at least the closest approach we can come to, is that rather than like trying to like browbeat people and like be mad constantly, even though there are reasons to be mad, you think of at least small gestures that you can make, like whether they be proposals or pieces of art, to say, look, you could do it better. Like if we can do it better in this studio with no budget, you can do it better for sure. So that's been kind of that's our approach.
Thanks so much. That actually kind of leads more or less directly into the next question, which was about kind of how interdependence came about, but maybe also what are the moments when you've thought, wow, I've never thought about that in this way before, or that you've actually found something kind of revelatory about what the people you've been talking to have said. And I have also to say, just again, if anyone's not listening to it, the range of things that you're talking about, but I also found the combination of kind of talking up to someone at Google Magenta about AI, but also talking about the history of post-war American music in Germany, or the role of the CIA in or not in abstract expressionism or cultural intellectual, seem to be kind of incredibly important to draw on all of those different ways of thinking about the world and seeing what happened when you kind of, maybe you're creating a kind of intellectual spawn where you're kind of creating
hopefully.
ideas generators that draw on the wisdom of the past.
Hopefully.
Well, I mean, this is something we wanted to do for years, but just never had time because we were on tour constantly. And it really is one of those kind of silver linings around COVID.
Yeah.
We finally were home and had the opportunity to do this, and we were able to do it through telephony. So that was
Telephone, yeah. This thing called the telephone.
Anyways, it was stable enough to be able to do, and the sound quality,
and everyone was at home.
The
right?
sound quality was good enough, and so we finally were able to do it, and it was actually really great because in some ways it kind of replaced our social life.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and the idea, I mean, talking about old ideas, like this is definitely like a very abridged version, but you know, we've been using the term interdependence for some time because we kind of came to the conclusion that like everything that we liked about independent music was the interdependent parts, and that in actuality, speaking about like, you know, new powerful institutions kind of using the subcultural expressions of the past, kind of like sampling, the same kind of happened with the idea of independence, right? Like everyone now, like the economy runs on an idea of independence, right? If you could probably, you know, like Uber runs on the idea of like, make your own schedule, like you're your own boss, right? Like, so again, one of these ideas that was probably a meaningfully kind of rebellious in like 1960, changes its meaning in the contemporary context. And so we ended up using the term interdependence quite often, to distinguish from that, being like, no, actually, like independence is often kind of mistaken, like isolation is often mistaken for independence. And in actuality, the story of like independent music, and I'm sure it's the same with independent film and other areas that we're less familiar with, but like the story was always one that actually the individual thrived because of an interdependent structure, right? That like you need you know, we talk about this with pop music, right? Like a pop star even is like a Formula One driver. Like, you know, they need this feat of engineering in order to be able to steer, you know, and you need someone special to be able to navigate that car, but the building of the car is what makes the thing possible, you know.
The pit crew
And the engineers and the, you know, whatever.
That's lovely. Yeah.
It's true. I mean, it's like you need a center forward's wonderful, but if there's no one to cross the ball, like you're not going to score many goals, right? But the so anyway, so with the podcast, I mean, really it was our opportunity in a sense to try and like, I mean, I sometimes feel embarrassed because we are strange in the range of stuff that we'll read, but the podcast was kind of an opportunity in a sense to kind of like open up the practice. So for those like few strange people who like do actually want to listen to why there might be a connection between you know, like post-war European funding and the conversation on AI, which I do think there is actually maybe a speculative connection there, you'd be able to dive in. Unfortunately, through some of the work we've been doing, we've been able to get hold of really good people, and they've been really generous. And I would say like if in terms of like surprises, I wonder
well, one of my favorite episodes is with Audrey Tang, and she's the digital minister of Taiwan, and she's just so interesting and delightful. So I would recommend that episode.
Yeah, that one, it's less like, how to put it, that one is less like a mind shift for me in terms of ideas I hadn't encountered before, but definitely a mind shift for me being like, oh my God, this is actually happening. Like,
or this is possible in government. It's like, I don't know.
Taiwanese state government is doing unbelievable things that, you know, you would read about in like weird theory books, and they're actually implementing it on the ground. We got to spend a bit of time in Taiwan actually, just before COVID. And that was the mind shift a little bit too, where you're like, look, actually the world is big, you know, that in actuality, there is something really rewarding to speaking to people from other places where like, oh yeah, you could just do that here. You know, you would like, you could just build, you could run these experiments. You could run these experiments in Taiwan. Like, why are you in Germany? Which she actually said to us. She's like, why are you in Germany? You should come and do this stuff in Taiwan, which sounds very lovely, but yeah, it's not that simple. Yeah. So I think speaking to people like that is like, it's a source of great optimism because, you know, even though we're quite critical on stuff, like we're believers, like we're sweet people, like I want things to be cool and nice, and so it's really spiriting to talk. You know, Twitter can be a minefield, and like the news is always miserable, and like it's nice to talk to people who are working on real stuff. Yeah.
I'm actually very glad that you mentioned that episode because it's one of my absolute favorites.
Cool.
I remember I had to call my friend who's actually in here to just say, sort of like recite the poem at the very beginning of the episode because I just thought it was so amazing. So if you haven't listened to that episode, definitely go do that. And actually it sort of like brings us to the next and almost final question, I think, which is very difficult, but I'm hoping you might have some answers after all your conversations. What does the best possible future or version of the future look like to you?
That's
throw that one at you.
crazy. I think it doesn't look like one thing. I think it looks like many things, and ideally, people would have the freedom and the mobility and the choice to be able to choose which future suits them best.
I think I would go somewhere along the same lines. I mean, like, which is it's tricky. So for example, I mentioned before, like working with decentralized web stuff. And that's one thing that people have, like, it's quite difficult to get your head around, is that I'll go and like give a talk about it or answer people's questions about it. And they're like, I don't like what you think about it. And I'm like, that's great. You don't have to like what I think about it, right? Because the whole idea is that there's no one central authority mandating how you live your life in this particular circumstance. And so for me, like the idea that like a decision I might make doesn't negatively impact you because you could choose to do something different, is a somewhat optimistic future, albeit like not completely uncomplicated. But given the circumstances of where we are at the moment, like at least in the realms that we deal with, the idea of breaking up and distributing power and equity a little bit sounds really like, that sounds like a very, very ambitious, but kind of achievable objective, you know? And so
Right,
that's yeah.
And also involving Aston Villa somehow winning the league or something.
That would be wonderful, but we're trying to be realistic here, Adam. That's
So just before we throw it open to questions, and there's already some very good ones there, but like we just wanted to mimic the way that you end Interdependence episodes by giving you a few terms and getting your immediate response to them. So Lily, we'll go first.
Okay, so the first term is materiality.
I'll let you do that one.
Ooh.
I thought it was a good one for you.
Oh, it's such a loaded term. Yeah. I mean, well, my first response is like I'm definitely like I'm politically quite materialist, and I'm aesthetically a how would you put it? Like I'm a non. Yeah, I'm a, what's the term? I'm not a digital dualist. Let's put it that way. Yeah, I mean, long story short, like I'm quite curious about ideas of the metaverse, but my proposal, at least whenever I've worked on stuff like that, is that the metaverse is a two-way street, and so I'm much more interested in like applying tech stuff facing toward us and like I don't know, making clubs like owned by thousands of people globally. Rather than the opposite of trying to like produce skeuomorphic clubs in video games, right? So I think it's not dualistic in the sense that you can have a digital hybrid, but my bias is toward flesh and like smell and hair and stuff.
Yeah.
Music.
Oh gosh,
Well,
this is hard. Okay. I remember back in the day when we were noise musicians, we would say, you know, one person's trash is the other person's music.
Treasure, yeah.
Yeah, it's the other person's treasure. I think, yeah, this is also such like a personal thing. This is hard. I
really liked actually when you talked about musicking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of musicking is that you're actually creating something in space with another human. That could be a virtual space or that can be a physical space, but it's this idea of responding musically with another human being. And that was something that was a huge part of the last record that we did, because I felt like so much of the music I was doing, even though we collaborate, we work separately in our studios and then we kind of combine the work together. And I was really missing that musicking experience of, trying out an idea, a phrase, and having somebody respond to that in real time. So that's one of the reasons why we put together the vocal ensemble, actually, because we were both missing the kind of musicking experience.
Totally.
I
That
kind
was a
of
decent- that was a good
dodged
but
that
it was
answer,
good.
really.
It was good. This is hard though.
No.
I mean, we took it from you, so
Yeah, I know.
and the next one is actually interdependence, because maybe you should get a chance to define the term also.
Oof. Would you want to go for that? Because I already went for it.
Oh, I would just say something simple, like just recognizing that we're stronger together.
Yeah, I think that's the big one. Is like, it's also just kind of a cool principle. I was thinking about like writing a Twitter bot. Have you ever had a Twitter bot respond to you if you put like, what's it, like it's or it apostrophe s, and you get it wrong, and then you get a Twitter bot come and be like, you spelt this wrong. Have you ever had that? It's a thing. It's a thing that there are like annoying like nag bots out there that some horrible person wrote to like point out your spelling mistakes. And I was thinking you could do the same for like independent music and interdependent music. Just like, I mean,
Please
people
don't
would,
do
yeah,
that,
people would
please.
hate me if I did it. But the point being is that yeah, it's it's kind of like a nice. There's probably a more wooey term for this, but like it's a nice reminder. It's a nice reminder that, yeah, like actually, and I can say that with full, like with no reservation whatsoever, that like everything that we've done, whether it's something that we're like personally really proud of or that's publicly recognized, which are two often very different things, happened as a result of groups of people contributing. And yeah, and we remember all of their names and are very grateful to those people, So I think that there's, and I think, I mean, not to rant about this too long, but I think we went from a period where I was talking earlier about like, we're stuck, with Spotify, like people have the same like realm of expression producing this generalist media that they did producing a record in the 1970s. We also, I think over time, what we will see is people are far less naive about how the sausage is made now. And that, in the 1970s, I mean, I wasn't around, so I'm speculating here, but like, you'd have a record come out and the audience was very much on the receiving end. Like the audience is very much the audience, right? And like now there's so like, on the one hand, you could say there's a kind of demystification going on where like everyone is in a position where they're having to promote themselves constantly. But I think that patina or that kind of like that smokescreen has kind of faded a little bit, or at least I would hope so. And so I think that the possibility of, for example, imagining a cultural product that is created by 1,000 people as opposed to one, and valuing that as a work of genius, as we have traditionally valued, the work of one person, which generally speaking was the work of 50 people, but let's forget that and leave that to the history books. I think that that's actually so much more feasible now. And so that, yeah.
I started thinking about that actually when I was using Ableton pretty regularly, because I was noticing that so many of the engineer decisions that were made were influencing my work. And sometimes that's a really bad thing. I would try to intervene and put kind of randomizers on some of my things so that Ableton wasn't pushing me in certain directions. But it really felt like it was, it's, especially with some of the more idiosyncratic instruments that I used from other engineers, it really feels like they're part of the piece. It's almost like a collaboration. So I think recognizing that is just an important and good thing to do.
Totally. Like some Japanese engineer made the 808 kick, and like very few people know who that is. But
I was really struck I think in your conversation with Jesse about talking about the piano or the program as kind of each having defining the way that you do. Okay, one last word for your response. Egan.
Oh God. Well, I'll let Holly answer that one, obviously.
I don't know. Some British stuff.
All I remember is the hill.
Okay.
I vividly, because I used to go out a lot and I would get the train. I mean, I don't even know what the train system's like now, but I would get the train from Waterloo. At the time you could smoke on the train, which was amazing. I would get the train back and I would stay in Waterloo Station overnight and get the first train back, often to go to class, which is probably not the most advisable thing to do. But I just remember that walk because I was like, yeah, I remember that walk very, very much. But Egham was great. I lived in Egham for 2 years, and then I moved to London for the final year. But yeah.
So Holly, you've not brought Holly. Yeah.
Not yet. I would actually like to. I think it would be really great to revisit, because I mean it's been a while, and I haven't. I mean, pretty much after I left, I spent another year living in London, and then I left the country. So, you know, we go in and out of the UK to play shows and do stuff like that, but you know, there wasn't really much opportunity to revisit. So yeah, I think it would be really wonderful to go back and revisit. Fingers crossed. When?
Well, I know the head of the school is in the audience, so I'm sure you will have
wonderful.
an open invitation to come whenever you want.
I was actually about to say, I realize some of the people in the audience won't have any idea what Egham is. This is where our campus is. So I might take the opportunity to say thank you to the PDA school, which, by the way, does not mean public display of affection. We had this discussion offline, or without the audience, but it is actually, you know, the School of Performing and Digital Arts. And yeah, thank you so much for making this series possible.
Thank you.
And I think maybe we'll open this conversation up to the audience, if you're happy.
Yeah, there have been a couple of questions. Maybe it's easy if I read to start with. So the first question is from Eduardo Harry Chobotnica Luerson, and he's asked, wants to know if your work Raising Spawn can give us a path or a hint on how to approach the very dense problem of labor and automation, and specifically how to approach the theme of collaboration and sharing in regard to music performance revenue.
Oof, this is such a huge topic. It's a quagmire. The way that we approached it is we just tried to set an example, perhaps, of how it could be done. So we were very careful to only use our own data sets. That was a really important point for us, because so much of the research that's happening right now is just people are just kind of scraping up data online. A lot of, you know, there's this issue with like dirty data and not compensating people. So instead, we wanted to record all of our own data sets and then be able to name and compensate those people that contributed to those data sets. So I think for us, it was more just trying to lead by example in that regard.
Yeah, I think there are principles that are applicable to other fields, like namely the first one, which is kind of doing away with the kind of fallacy of an artificial intelligence, like that we aren't quite there. I mean, there are some systems that are kind of self-generating, that there are some basic systems that can at this point like play checkers or something, that learn from themselves, and those are really impressive. But generally speaking, when we're talking about automation, we're talking about human work recorded and kind of and re-performed, and you know, when you're dealing with like it's difficult to say labor and automation kind of broadly, because I'm sure there's all kind of idiosyncrasies. There are all kind of idiosyncrasies to it, but the basic gesture of saying that, of kind of demystifying things and saying, no, look, actually, like these tools are remarkable, and they come from somewhere, and generally they're coming from human beings. You know, the classic example for those who are completely unfamiliar being that, you know, Google Translate is derived from the work of human translators, and it's really cool. It's a really cool efficiency that same human translator doesn't have to translate 100,000 articles. You know, that their work can be replicated, but you also can't have it be the case that work isn't properly compensated. And so striking that balance, I think you start off on a good foot striking that balance if you start out by acknowledging that this is coming from human beings. You start off on a better foot than if you start from I believe the fallacious but commonly kind of parroted assumption that this is coming from a sentient machine, which is just not. That's fantasy.
And a lot of that fantasy is facilitated and perpetuated by Silicon Valley itself,
totally,
because that serves the purpose of not having to compensate and deal with these issues.
Yeah.
So
make people pee in bottles meantime for the joy of being independent. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
That's so horrible.
Yeah, that is.
Oh, Adam, you're muted.
Yeah, also,
Oh,
There we
you're
go.
muted.
Again. I think I tried to unmute you and I ended up muting you.
Yeah, that's fine. Fastest
My
finger
power
first.
is horrible.
Lily, why don't you ask the next question?
I was actually going to say if, yeah, perhaps if people want to join us with their microphones and
Yeah,
cameras, that, you know, that there's also a possibility. But I will try and read out the next question. So it's from Lucy. Speaking to the idea of feeding Spawn a healthy diet, did you learn any of your own bad habits from what Spawn took up?
That's an interesting question because so I didn't train Spawn on any of my compositional form, specifically because I didn't want to repeat any of my compositional decisions of the past. So I decided just to train Spawn on my voice and on the voice of my ensemble. So if anything, I had to hear kind of like cringy naked recordings of my own voice, or if you're familiar with my work, it's all very processed and digitized, so hearing kind of like my naked voice is always a bit jarring. But yeah, so maybe not so many bad habits per se, because I was really trying to steer clear of recreating ideas from the past. That was like a very conscious decision.
Well, the closest thing I can think of, the clip we played earlier of the call and response song. This is kind of mean, but but
Okay.
no, but it's funny because everyone's singing the same song, and then when you compile like that data set together of all the different recordings, you see how much drift there is.
Oh, well, that's true.
Where when you play them on top of each other, it sounds completely cacophonous because it's always like slightly.
Well, it's actually really interesting because you can kind of compare country to country, like different choral traditions in a way. Actually, like a lot of the UK concerts were like insanely beautiful.
Yeah, people were like loud as well for some reason. The
And
UK is
singing
like,
in harmony, and
yeah.
it's like obviously places where there are deep choral traditions, and then
Yeah.
there are some places I think in Germany where like things are kind of like veering off to the side, and you can always hear that one guy who's just like loving it but is totally tone deaf,
Yeah.
and he's like standing really close to the microphone.
But in terms of our habits, yeah, it's tricky because it's like most of the work we've done is really just on training models, and then using those with kind of style transfer systems. So it
we kind of safeguarded ourselves a bit from
Yeah.
having to analyze our habits too much.
thank you. There's a Joel, are you there? Do you want to ask your question?
It's very strange.
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, thanks.
Hey.
It's in the hi. Thanks so much. I'm really enjoying this. It's a delight to speak to you both. So my question is over in the chat, but I'll just repeat it. So I'm just interested in how you think about your collaborative relationship with Spawn. So at times in certain interviews, you seem to attribute a kind of creative agency to Spawn, that she plays this really important role in driving the creative process, opening up new kinds of musical expression and composition perhaps that wouldn't otherwise be there. But on the other hand, you seem hesitant to attribute any sort of robust creative authorship to Spawn. I think Holly said in one interview that I'm the author. I want credit for the works that I'm creating. So I just wanted to invite you both to speak a bit about this tension between creative agency and authorship and how you think about collaborating with Spawn.
That's a good question. That's a really good question.
Go ahead.
No, you.
Oh, well, I don't really give her authorship, but she does make certain decisions that are a surprise at times. So in a similar way to where a human performer, when I give them a score, will interpret something, Spawn in a very similar way will interpret a line and come up with things that I wouldn't normally, decisions that I wouldn't have made. But it's statistical analysis. I try to be really careful about not seeing that as like a sentient kind of creative expression of the line. It's the particular way that the statistical analysis of that particular algorithm is responding to this input. So I try to be really sober in it, even though it's easy to kind of get lost in the romance of it a little bit. But while it is still statistical analysis, it still can in some ways activate similar ideas and compositional interactions that you would have with a kind of human performer. So
yeah, I think it's kind of similar to what I would say there is, I think actually like the hesitancy there and the tension, first off, I think it's a great observation because that actually is there. And I would say that most likely that tension is there because the kind of, I mean, on the one hand, exactly, like Spawn can make decisions that will confound you as effectively as a human attempting to perform something with a clear instruction, right? And that is absolutely the truth. And at the same time, again, it's this tension of like dealing with, you know, like dealing with a wider public and press. We don't want to be the people being like, the robots are here, like, you know, run for your life, you know, because it's such low hanging fruit and it's done too often. And I actually find it really cheesy and really unhelpful. That being said, in very private conversations, you know, one can imagine a circumstance in which those models are trained sufficiently enough to confound you far beyond the capabilities of most human performers when given a prompt, right? That reality is something that like privately we'll entertain, but aren't prepared in like a very public context to come out and say like, you're all screwed, you know, like AIs will be better than anybody, because of course that's not true. And like, it's not resolved. And actually that politic is there to be like contested now, you know, and that's why ultimately I think this idea of augmentation, of saying like, you know, if you train a vocal model to be, you know, could you sing through a vocal model that would be your best vocal performance always? Is that a more interesting way of thinking about the future of singing AI than we can train a karaoke machine to sound like Aretha Franklin, right? Like, I think that, and there's a really minor line there, but that's maybe our distinction is being like, okay, that's kind of the thing we'll push for, but the tension is totally there. I think it's a really good question.
Thanks. Olga, do you want to ask your question? I don't know if my colleague
Olga has a human toddler. I mean, the toddler is very, very welcome to participate.
We can read
too.
Olga's question.
Yeah. Okay.
Where is it?
So, Olga, I wonder if there's a point of fracture in the way that style expropriation might work. One of the issues with, quote, style transfer, unquote, techniques is that their notion of style is relatively shallow. Style is treated as a generator of a quasi-recognizable surface, rather than being a way in which an artist engages at a deep formal level with the objects and the ideas they engage with. How might this fracture be opened up along lines you're pointing towards?
Go ahead.
You want to go, Phil?
No, you go first.
I'm just going to try and, there's a point of fracture in the way that style expropriation might work. I mean, okay. It is, yeah, it's true. I mean, I wonder, like, I don't think you're doing this, but I think generally speaking, there is like a semantic error that can happen, right? Where like, there's style in a lot of the work that we're doing ultimately is like, when you talk about style transfer, that term has been, we are actually appropriating that term from similar experiments that happened in the visual realm, right? It's far more appropriate if you're thinking about changing. It's more appropriately like to talk about like timbre transfer, you know, which has kind of a history. Like actually the system that we were using earlier with the flute voice,
that's, you know, a style transfer.
Well, it's a timbre transfer. Right. I mean, that's something that you could do on a Kima system forever with its external processing unit. The only difference being is that we're able to train a model to produce a model, right? And so like, so there is something superficial to the style term because it gets kind of used in a gajillion different ways, right? Like when you're talking about like MIDI, like things that spit out MIDI compositions, there the claim to style is maybe a bit more robust in the sense that it's saying, okay, well, we can identify, you know, like patterns between the way this composer tends to write a melody or tends to write harmony. That's the style there. Yeah. So first off, it's kind of we should probably just use timbre transfer in that particular case, but even that's not perfect for what we're doing. But I think that, yeah, my takeaway, at least from your question, I hope we're responding to it, is that that overextension of the the term style to encompass everything also leads to a lot of confusion right? Where I completely agree with, I think what you were saying there, where, you know, people are saying, oh, well, in the future, that means that, you know, a machine will be able to copy the style of Miles Davis. And I'm like, well, how would one begin to do that? You know, and this is a point that you've talked about a lot in the past, is just like, you know, when you think about these really crude approximations of what a thing is, you know, like MIDI, for example, being like the crudest approximation of what music is, right? Like you have so many different like dimensional things to what music is than like sheet music, even. Like it is a very crude kind of representation. Yeah, whenever you kind of like mistake the map for the world or whatever, right? Like there's a tension there, and that's why ultimately I think the augmentation approach of not trying to displace anything and not trying to fully quantify anything, but instead just give people tools to augment what their capabilities are. It kind of nicely navigates around the problem of that. And I hope your question was like very good and very detailed, and I hope that addressed some of it.
Sadly, Olga says she has a human toddler on her head, which is why she's not able to switch the.
That sounds very warm. That sounds great. Sounds cozy.
Reed, do you want to ask your question on mic?
Okay, I'm gonna try, but apologies, my Wi-Fi connection is not great. So if you lose
sound
me,
great. Don't worry.
Okay, here we go. So my question is about your work on ASMR, which I know is a little while ago now, but I'm dragging it back up. Yeah, like I really like something about it really resonated with me, and it sent me down this kind of like path of researching and kind of being interested in the like ways that we can like experience and express intimacy in digital platforms. In particular ways that are like asynchronous. So for example, like when people record like ASMR videos, they're kind of like posted and then people access them at various different times and places and like recall that expression of intimacy, or that involve like automated or non-human participants. I'm bringing this back up because obviously the last year has kind of led to a sort of rediscovery perhaps of some of these ideas for obvious reasons for a lot of people. And I just wondered what your kind of thoughts on kind of the future direction of those things might be. Because yeah, I think like it's something that I thought about a lot a couple of years ago and then kind of dropped, and then like recently has like been dragged straight back up into the front of my consciousness again, because like I'm constantly kind of mediating my intimacy through like this very platform, you know.
Yep.
So yeah, I'd really like to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly why I was interested in it, was because of this idea of digital intimacy. And there was this, this was a while ago. This was like, what, 6 years ago, I guess, around the same time of Home. And there was this kind of idea that you couldn't, that the kind of feelings that people were having and the relationships that people were expressing through these digital platforms weren't as real or weren't as visceral. And ASMR was such a wonderful example of kind of a counter to that point. Also, just as a kind of sound nerd, I mean, I just loved that it actually had like a physical, I experience ASMR, like I get all the feels and the tingles. So I really wanted to tap into that as well. And then also just this idea of, so much of it was important that we take a critical view with pieces like Home, but I also wanted to find parts of the internet that were places for kind of care. And I found it really interesting that people were, some people were getting paid through Patreon or whatever, but a lot of this space is just people volunteering their time to care for one another. And I was so blown away by the comment sections in YouTube. Like, if anybody is used to posting their work on YouTube, like don't ever check the comment sections, because it's usually just like will make you feel horrible about yourself. But actually with ASMR, it was amazing. People were giving each other tips for how to sleep better, or just, writing words of encouragement. And it was just this very different kind of part of YouTube, which is, of course, this kind of corporate monolith that usually represents other things, I think, to people. So I was really interested in kind of the culture around ASMR.
Yeah, I think for me, it's such a lesson, right? That like, I mean, this is a broader point, but like, and I have no doubt encountered this in like academic programs where like for the past 100 years, right, the future has been like things that look like they're from like Space Odyssey, like these huge structures with screens and lasers and whatever. And it's like, no, actually, like you all missed the MP3, right? Like while you were thinking that the future of music was going to look like, you know, Star Trek or something in this, actually the MP3 was kind of the future of music. And I feel the same with ASMR and other like very internet native things. Is like, you know, I personally have pushed back. I mean, it's fine, people are experimenting, but like, you know, this whole idea of like trying to create clubs online or something, like where I'm like, why would you do that? You know, it's like clubs are great. Like clubs are great for people who love being online too, because you get to not be online. But ASMR, you know, ASMR is like the exact opposite, where it's like, this is so like, you can tell that people need it, because if they didn't need it, they would feel like really weird, right? It's like you're like touching a binaural microphone, thinking about touching the ears of thousands of people. I mean, it's just like, that's something that could have only happened. It's so native to the medium that it's fascinating, and it's not bells and whistles. And in fact, actually, you said that. I mean, like I remember when Lonely at the Top, which for those who don't know was like the ASMR piece that was on the record in like a while ago, you know, and there were people who were like mad about it, because their relationship with ASMR was like very real. This wasn't like an art appreciation relationship. They were like, no, if it's an ASMR thing, I expect to go in there and not be disturbed, you know. And that's a very, very different relationship to music as we know it, and it's native to the space. So I can see why you would be dragged back into it as an area of interest, because I don't think it's a fad. And in fact, if anything, I think some of the peculiarity of it sadly led to it being treated a little bit like a fad, you know, above ground, you know, like there's a lot of people who like will deride it, but it persists, and I'm sure it's just as strong as it ever will be, and it probably will outlive many of the kind of hackneyed and time-stamped kind of ideas of the future that we have now, you know. People
and that goes back to that original question of what is music. And you
Yeah.
know, when I put that on my album, my label was like, oh,
Yeah.
it's a bit of a stretch. It's like, this is really important. It has to be right in the middle of the album. So.
No, but I mean, yeah, it's a you know.
I'm amazed about, you were talking about kind of small changes. The fact that you found the positive area of the YouTube comments is already a kind of vision of the future. So the best of humanity is there. We have one question from Claire Redelman. Claire, I don't know if you want to read it or speak it. And but I just also say we probably got time for maybe one more after this, if you're around, able to.
Yeah,
stay
sure, we're around. Don't worry.
So
yeah.
if people do have questions, do pop them in the chat. Claire.
Thanks. So what I put was that I'm wondering if there's an analogous development in music as what I perceive going on in visual culture, photography especially, where there are these debates about invisible images, kind of the image transforming into data and kind of getting away from the human perceiver, right? Mm-hmm. Sorry, back to what I wrote, and how we used to think about images as fundamentally kind of having to be viewed by a human. Mm-hmm. But now in kind of photography, visual culture, facial recognition, I feel like there's this kind of mounting recognition that this is really changing a lot. Is there a kind, and I'm sorry to try to kind of shoehorn in like understanding your art form by way of a different art form with which I'm more familiar, but I'm kind of curious that like, is there a similar dynamic going on, or is there a similar anxiety perhaps, even if it's not a real dynamic, about kind of music or what you make as artists kind of getting away from the human perceiver? Or is it really rooted in like needing, this is about like a human listener, it is the human consciousness that kind of creates meaning in response to what you make? What are your thoughts about that?
I don't know so much about this invisible image concept, but it sounds really interesting. I would say maybe the closest parallel to that would be just the dynamics of algorithmic recommendation systems. So really, I guess a parallel would be kind of like trying to make music that appeals to the algorithm so that it will then appear in as many playlists as possible. So rather than thinking about the kind of human listener, you're thinking of kind of like pleasing this invisible algorithm to try to kind of game the system. I don't know if that kind of answers your question a bit.
it's also because I imagine in photography, are you familiar with Trevor Paglin? Awesome. So Trevor's a good friend of ours. And the whole idea of like seeing like a machine or like hearing like a machine is somewhat relevant, I think, also to this idea of how to put it, like, you know, establishing the provenance in communication with you know, a machine intelligence or some kind of a bot, right? Because like it's not necessarily that you would make work for that invisible agent, but there is the reality that when you document something now, irrespective of whether it may be a photograph or a piece of audio, that is machine legible. Like, we're now aware of that, you know what I mean? Like that's not an abstraction anymore. And so thinking through that is somewhat important. I mean, one example, for example, that we're playing with at the moment, I don't know if anyone here's played around with Clip. It's a new OpenAI system. You can play around. There's like collabs out there, but Clip is basically like a semantic image generation system. So you've probably seen like, you know, kind of like GUI AI face art things where like the face is moving, and yeah, exactly. So usually those are generated by like archetypes. Now Clip is insane because you can basically type something in and you can say like, produce a woman that has red hair and glasses and, you know, 4 eyes or something. And if it has a concept of that, it will produce it based on your text input. Now Clip knows who Holly is. So you can go on there and say, make this baby look like Holly Herndon, and the baby will start looking like Holly Herndon. And that was not something that you approved. That was not something that, like, you know, and so in a sense, it's like, I don't think in the realm of audio, we've really had to deal with it so much, but there are little cues like that that suggest that you're going to have to be, whether you like it or not, somewhat familiar with those kind of systems going forward, or it's just going to be difficult to ignore. I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Rosa is asking if you need a VPN to access Clip. That is a technical question.
I don't think so.
I don't think so. There's a great, if you search like StyleGAN Clip collab, COLAB, there's a great one out there by, I forget the guy's name. He has a Russian name. But I mean, maybe in the UK, I have no idea. I mean, I know that there are some, yeah, the UK internet can be somewhat restricted in some areas. Are you sure you spelled Clip correctly? But the, yeah, I expect you'll find it. If you search StyleGAN Clip collab, you can play around with it, and maybe you need a VPN in UK. I'm not
And
sure.
we don't use a VPN here.
We don't hear it, no.
Yeah, we've just found out it's apparently blocked in the UK. I also Googled it while you mentioned it and I couldn't find anything. So thank you, Rosa, for finding this out for us.
Wow.
A lot of things are weird here at the moment, so I'm not that bad.
That's really peculiar. Okay. I want to know why it's blocked. Yeah. So Karen, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just saying, well, I'm not sure that we seem to have reached the end of our questions. Thank you, Matt and Holly, for like some really fantastic engagement. It's wonderful to have had you here. And you've already been heartily invited to come. Holly, Matt will walk you up from the station to Royal Holloway, and it is rather beautiful.
It
and
is.
The chapel and the place where music is made is rather good, and actually, certainly there's some very, very fine music makers, and a wonderful choir who I'm sure could be engaged to kind of harmonize with you or with Spawn. And I have also to say that the Sacred Harp singing was wonderful, but also the moment when the singers appeared in the audience is a moment that was absolute kind of wonderful kind of coup de théâtre about kind of how you formed both, you know, so that you were the digital, the musical, the media, and the performing arts to make sure that every part of the school was included. But it's hugely exciting both to hear the kind of interface between what you're making, both kind of as software, as music, as performance, as media, and how you're thinking about it. And to the conversation on the Interdependence podcast, which everybody should be, you know, subscribing to, but which is a real wonderful conversation carried on very much in this spirit, which is kind of thoughtful, eclectic, wide-ranging, incredibly well-informed. But I think it's also been incredibly useful to hear what the kinds of thinking that comes out of your making. And it felt very early on, you said, like, put on a show, and then in order to kind of make yourself starting to think about things, and certainly the screenplays that I've never written are far better than the ones that I've actually kind of put on paper. You know, the films, the unmade films, as we know, are the best. I don't know if that's true for all musicians, but it seems to me that actually the ways in which you are making and putting stuff out there for people to engage with is hugely exciting, and thank you for everything that you're doing.
Well, thank you for being so kind. That's really wonderful to hear. And yeah, you're totally right. There's it's weird too, because we're also like super slow. And that's the other side that, like, I think is, it bucks the trend a little bit, because everyone, and particularly the like people who are just starting out, I think you've had it like banged into your head constantly that you've got to be producing all the time. And
well,
it's
Daniel Ek thinks that musicians should release an album every year. So
an album every 3 months.
Every 3 months, excuse me. But because we're involved in so many different fields, we have so many different kind of forms of media that we're creating. It doesn't really work to, at least it doesn't work for us to produce so quickly.
Yeah.
But that's okay.
Yeah,
we're loving that podcast, so I think, you know, nobody here is complaining. We're like,
that's wonderful. Well, no, it really means a lot. And and we're, you know, if anyone has other stuff that they want to follow up on, we're frequently online, and generally get back to everybody. It might take a few days sometimes, but
thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the thoughtful questions.
Yeah, really, the questions were wonderful. And yeah, I hope to be anywhere else right now, but like, but would also be lovely to revisit the campus. It would be very surreal, because it's been quite some time.
Okay, well, it would be wonderful to have you back. Just also to say that the set of talks, of which this is one, continues everywhere it is machines, is the title, organized by Lily and a group of the doctoral students in the School of Performing and Digital Arts. So if you've come along for Matt and Holly, stay for the rest of the season, but otherwise thank everybody. It's been really a wonderful evening, and thanks so much.
Thank you. Be safe and healthy. I hope you all get vaccinated soon.
You too.
Bye.